Late in World War II in the Pacific Theater, the need for strategic bombers being able to hit mainland Japan and Okinawa became greater. When Allied forces finally captured Iwo Jima after an exhaustive bombing campaign and ground assault, this enabled them to finally station fighters at a location which would enable them to escort the bombers, who were based in the Mariana Islands, to and from the target while staying inside their range constraints. These missions, often lasting upwards of 15 hours, were called very long-range missions. The P-51s that were stationed at Iwo Jima were very unique. Since they were flying escort missions, there were little constraints on what was considered a suitable paint job and what wasn't. Hence the various colorful liveries you see displayed in photographs as well as videos at the time. Iwo Jima was definitely a bustling place. Here are some pictures of what the base was like and what the airfield entailed. Here is an aerial of P-51s lined up at Iwo Jima. Take note of the various stripes and colors that decorate the aircraft's tails and wing surfaces. The pilots often referred to themselves as the Tokyo Pony Express, the Tokyo Pony Club, or the Sunsetters, due to the length and location of the missions. This photo specifically shows the drop tanks that were used in the VLR missions being unloaded from trucks and strapped onto planes. Naturally, everybody who was stationed there were all human. Therefore, there were times for games and shenanigans. Here we see one instance titled The Bug, which is a makeshift buggy fashioned out of a old drop tank and a small motor. Iwo also served as an emergency landing location for returning B-29s from bombing missions over mainland Japan. Here we see a B-29 at Iwo being refueled by 4 trucks at the same time, and it is unclear whether or not this one landed due to mechanical issues or if this was one of the navigational B-29s. We also see a P-51 Mustang being refueled in the same manner. Now, what did the typical VLR escort mission look like? Well, in 1945, Iwo Jima was the home to 3 groups of P-51s. There were the 15th Fighter Group, comprising of the 45th, 47th, and 78th Fighter Squadrons. They arrived in March 1945. The 21st Fighter Group, comprised of the 46th, 72nd, and 531st Fighter Squadrons. They also arrived in early 1945. And the 506th Fighter Group, consisting of the 457th, 458th, and 462nd Fighter Squadrons. However, these arrived later in the war around April 1945. During the VLR escort missions in 1945, B-29 superfortresses were primarily based in the Mariana Islands, specifically the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Saipan was home to Isley Field, one of the primary airfields for B-29 operations. This housed the 73rd Bombardment Wing. Tinian had Northfield, also known as Tinian Airfield. This was the largest airfield complex in the Pacific during World War II. Northfield is notably where the Enola Gay took off for the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. Notably, the 58th Bombardment Wing, comprising of the 313th Bombardment Wing, which had the 6th Bombardment Group, the 9th Bombardment Group, the 504th Bombardment Group, and the 505th Bombardment Group. And finally, the 509th Composite Group, which entailed the 393rd Bombardment Squadron, were also stationed at Tinian. Anderson Field, later Anderson Air Force Base, was on Guam, and it was another major base for B-29 operations, hosting the 314th Bombardment Wings, which was notably comprised of the 19th Bombardment Group, the 29th Bombardment Group, the 39th Bombardment Group, and the 330th Bombardment Group. Takeoff was always at or close to full power, with 40 inches of manifold pressure, 3,000 RPM, and fuel mixture set to auto-rich. Immediately after climb-out, each pilot set his engine for minimum fuel consumption. This was setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean, the manifold pressure at 38 inches, engine RPM at 2,000, and then slowly reducing his engine RPM until the engine cut out, which usually happened at about 1750 or 1850 RPM, then increasing it again until the engine began running smoothly. The Mustangs had fuel tanks in each wing with a total capacity of 185 gallons, as well as the ability to carry 60 or 90 gallon auxiliary tanks under each wing, and a fuselage tank with a capacity of 85 gallons. The fuselage tank, however, made the Mustang heavy in the air, and pilots often preferred it near empty when dogfighting, as it had more of a tendency to snap roll with the fuselage tank full than empty. After takeoff and forming up, P-51 Mustangs would fly to the island of Iwo Jima, which was effectively a rock 40 miles north of Iwo, and they would rendezvous with the navigational B-29s, which would take them to the main bomber stream. The Outbound Cruise would be held at 205 miles per hour with 2,000 RPM and 29 to 30 inches of manifold pressure whilst in auto-lean. Pilots often tried to keep the Merlins just above the cutoff point. Every half hour, the formation would run the engines up to full power in order to clean out the carbon buildup and keep the engines running reliably for the trip. This, however, burnt up a set of spark plugs for every trip, and when P-51s landed after a very long escort mission, they were instantly put into maintenance to have their spark plugs replaced. Even then, many P-51s had to turn back due to excessive engine wear. This would result in an average fuel consumption of about 40 gallons per hour. When in combat over Japan, typically maximum or near maximum power was used, ignoring the cruise control techniques that were exercised on the way into Japan. This often resulted in P-51s falling short of Iwo Jima and having to bail out over the water. The presence of the bottom scoop on the P-51 as part of its radiator system meant that ditching in a P-51 on water was highly unadvisable, as the plane would flip over. One Major Van Hay recalls how a big friend helped him get home to Iwo Jima. Quote, "When I started back, I called a B-29 and told him I was low on fuel and to take me home by the shortest possible route. He said, 'Get on my wing, little brother.' We went through some weather without difficulty, and about 100 miles from Iwo, he led me through an overcast and asked how I was doing. I looked at my tank gauges and said, 'I don't think I'm going to make it.' The B-29 alerted Rescue Dumbo, which was an ASR flying boat, and came out on our heading. And I started saying the rosary. We broke out at about 4,000 feet, and Iwo was dead ahead. Being a poor swimmer, I was ready to dead stick it from 4,000 feet. I made a straight-in approach, dropped my gear, and when I three-pointed it, the engine conked out. I didn't even have enough gas to taxi." End quote. On the return flight, the pilots dropped their tanks, shot up all of their ammo, and then set their RPM to about 1,800 with full throttle at 10,000 feet. Then they would pull the mixture back until their wingman signaled that the coolant shutter was coming open, and then eased it forward just a tad. According to pilots, quote, "This setting worked like a charm, though the mixture control was set up to fly only in selected places. We would indicate about 210 and burn about 40 gallons per hour. This would burn up a set of spark plugs, but it didn't seem to bother the engines." End quote. After egressing from the target, the P-51s would peel off and head to the rendezvous point where 6 B-29 navigation planes in 3 pairs would lead them home. These were the same B-29s that the P-51s rendezvoused with at Iwo Jima, and they would orbit off of the coast in pairs at the rendezvous points, waiting for the P-51s to return in order to navigate back to Iwo Jima. As the Mustangs began reaching the rendezvous point, the first pair of B-29s would wait until about half of the number of fighters had arrived, and then they would set a course for Iwo. The other 2 pair of superfortresses would depart the coast at 10-minute intervals, allowing latecomers to be able to follow their way home, and the last B-29 to depart would continually transmit on the Uncle Dog frequency, which is a experimental radio navigation beacon system that they used, so any remaining stragglers could attempt to find their way home. Boredom was almost always a common enemy. Many pilots experimented with the navigational B-29 slipstream and found that if you flew right close to the right rear blister, aerodynamically the P-51 would get locked into position and would almost fly itself for the duration of the flight. However, most B-29 pilots got skittish of this fact due to the close proximity of the planes and would increase their throttle setting, resulting in the disruption of aerodynamic forces and resulting in the P-51 being kicked out of that position. Due to the fuel constraints discussed before, there was a complex landing plan developed to enable the quickest amount of fighters to land in the shortest amount of time to prevent anybody running out of fuel while waiting for their turn to land. After landing, many pilots needed to be helped out of their planes from utter exhaustion after flying for 15 hours. Later on in the war, pilots often commented on the enemy's reluctance or seeming hesitance to engage with P-51s in dogfights, and towards the very end of the war, there was very few enemy fighters being put up against the B-29s. Therefore, a group of P-51s would be left as top cover, while the rest of the P-51s, about 90 or so, would dive down at treetop level and strafe ground targets such as airfields, fuel depots, and supply lines. The Japanese employed many concepts and theories in an effort to dissuade the P-51s from doing such things, such as straining cable across airfields and targets in hopes of catching an unsuspecting P-51 pilot, activating flying landmines that fly up to about 10 feet and explode when activated, as well as increasing the anti-aircraft emplacements. Whilst this did affect pilots' vigor and anticipation in strafing ground targets, many pilots simply stated that they flew low enough and fast enough to avoid the wires and the mines, some even remarking that they had to pull up to shoot inside of hangars because they were flying at such an altitude. This is, of course, where we get the Cadillac of the Skies scene from Empire of the Sun, directed by Steven Spielberg. This scene truly depicts the utter chaos and riveting speed in which the P-51s would scream in at.
Get everybody inside as quick as you can! Away from the building! Stop what
Combat losses varied from 1 to 2 Mustangs to, on the worst days, 20 to 30. However, many more Mustangs were lost due to mechanical issues, weather problems, or other related things. In the first few missions in 1945 that the Iwo Jima Mustangs flew escorts as, fighter opposition varied from between 60 to 120 fighters. Towards the end of the war, those numbers trickled off. At the very end, Fighter Command resolved to send P-51s alone with 5-inch HVAR rockets and bombs to attack targets instead of having them escort B-29s. By the end of the war, the Iwo Jima Mustangs were flying a hybrid mission set, part escorting B-29s and other parts bombing and attacking high-value targets on their own. All things considered, VLR missions are undoubtedly one of the most tough and taxing missions that a pilot could be asked to fly. My respect for any individual who partook in such missions is quite high due to the amount of stress and fatigue involved, as well as the general skill and conduct that the missions demanded, such as strict radio silence, precision formation flying, as well as a good decision-making complex. If you would like to learn more about such missions, I will have all of the research links that I used below in the description, as well as I am hosting a 1946 Heritage reenactment mission. It is going to be about 6 hours long, and it will involve a very long-range escort mission flying P-51s out of Iwo Jima, escorting B-29s to bomb Tokyo. 1946 is a very versatile sim, offering great performance for the price and the graphics. You are able to have hundreds, if not thousands, of aircraft flying in the same mission at the same time with relatively low performance impacts. This is why it is the ideal sim for massive bombing raids like this. If you're interested, please click the flag in the top right corner, which will direct you to a video with details on that. Additionally, I am currently playing through a Tokyo Pony campaign, which goes into detail what life was like for P-51s stationed at Iwo Jima around the same time period. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and please consider subscribing. Let me know what you think in the comments below.
This channel is centered around all things flight sim related, primarily focusing on getting the most out of limited options in the market and various other fixations my brain decides to focus on. Please consider subscribing.